So let's talk about what is the Vietnam War. Here we see Ray Tater's Reflections of Vietnam, which was painted in 1988. Here we see the memorial for the Vietnam War with a list of names that were lost in the war of soldiers. Here we see a soldier who's grappling with his grief, and here we see all the soldiers that served with him and the memories of them being painted in this imagery. It's very powerful because it really kind of grapples with the kind of loss and the lack of clarity that we have with regard to the war itself. So let's talk about the war. History is always difficult because individual things don't exist within their own sphere. So let me explain what I mean. When we talk about Vietnam, we're talking about essentially troop uptick, the aggressive growth of troops begins around 1961. But the thing is, we have military advisors in Vietnam long before then, right? And we'll get to that in a minute. But when we talk about 1961 to 1972, we're still in the Cold War, that we're still dealing with the civil rights movement, that in fact we're dealing with the women's rights movement as well, that American identity is consistently being challenged. And so when we call attention to all of this, we have to come to terms with the fact that this troop engagement within Vietnam itself is all happening within the landscape of that involvement, right? War is changing, right? Vietnam was not a real geographic war. Sure, there was a war fought in Vietnam against North Vietnamese, particularly against the National Liberation Front, against all of these ideas, but the thing is, there was no real clear path for victory. It was a war of stability to some degrees, right? As much as we were fighting the National Liberation Front in South Vietnam, we were really fighting China and Russia and their geopolitical landscape of public opinion, right? The public perception of the war is dependent upon how Americans produce the war, whether it was to some degree on the public landscape as a war of freedom, as a war of stability. These kinds of arguments kind of get to the heart of how complicated the war is, right? Kennedy and Johnson have declared war on communism. Vietnam just happens to be one of those fronts where communism is being fought. Johnson would also declare war on poverty. And where would that fight go? Chicago, New York, Los Angeles, right? Those would be the front lines of that war on poverty. Nixon would declare war on drugs. And where would that war be fought? Of course, again, Chicago, Baltimore, New York, all of these key urban centers. And of course, when George W. Bush declares war on terrorism, where does that war get fought? It's easy to conceptualize a victory of a war for geography. If you hold certain terrain, then you've won the war, right? But it's hard to understand these kind of ideological wars because the terms of victory are rooted in the very nature of the term itself, right? So when we talk about Vietnam, the terms of victory deals with containment. If communism doesn't spread, then we win, right? This is a long-standing pattern within the communism war, right? So let's talk about Vietnam itself. We'll get to 1961, the Bay of Pigs, but before we get to the Bay of Pigs, we really have to understand the nature of the communism war before then, right? Starting in 1946, Ho Chi Minh invited Americans to mitigate a dispute between the Vietnamese and their French colonial occupiers. The United States would instead loan France $160 million to crush Ho Chi Minh's nationalist forces. By 1949, China and Russia would also intervene, pouring in money to the North Vietnamese and essentially Ho Chi Minh's army, and in the process help fund resistance to France's occupation. By 1950, the United States begins to directly aid France militarily with military advisors. And by 1954, on the eve of the Geneva Peace Convention, Ho Chi Minh's forces are able to kick France out of North Vietnam entirely, thus splitting Vietnam into two distinct countries. And then the very next year, France will ultimately abandon Vietnam, as North Vietnamese begin to crack down on landowners, killing and imprisoning any dissenters who dissent with Ho Chi Minh's rule. Eisenhower would step in, filling the gap, arguing that we need to pour in more military advisors to help the South Vietnamese fight the war. But it becomes murky as to how much America is involved, because again, this is 1955, and theoretically, America has not declared war on North Vietnam. And what's even more complicated is that we start using public private industry in order to facilitate our war effort, right? Another core component complication is American universities directly compete over civilian contracts to help rebuild the South Vietnamese area, right? All of this is before the war. So, Michigan State University is one such university who won a contract, and they began building education facilities within Vietnam. The goal is to teach Vietnamese citizens both the cutting edge tactics of policing but also the cutting edge tactics of bureaucracy and administrative development. And it's through these new administrative centers, guess what? The CIA begins operating and sending operatives to the North Vietnamese area. These new CIA operatives give the American government unprecedented influence on the Vietnamese affairs. By 1956, the CIA, using Operation Passage to Freedom, is able to bring 450,000 Vietnamese from North Vietnam to the South. And again, more and more concern begins to come up within the American press. We start asking ourselves, are we involved in Vietnam? Is this something we should be focused on more? And then in 19, Cao Dinh Diem is elected as prime minister. And he rises to power with the backing of United States diplomatic support. 4 years later, 1959, Charles Ovand and Dale R. Buis die on military actions within Vietnam. And now news begins to spread within the American newspapers as editorials begin questioning, are we involved? Is this going to be the next North Korea, right? And that's a key debate that starts to crop up. Meanwhile, though, in 1961, we're also contending with our own complications because John F. Kennedy is elected, and in the process, the CIA is actively engaged in training resistance fighters to try and overthrow Castro. When news breaks out with the failed Bay of Pigs invasion, what we end up seeing crop up out of this is this attempt by the United States government to try and reshape the public's perception. They argue they were not involved, and here we see it within British publications.
Cuban revolutionary troops such as these have invaded Castro's leftist island fortress, reportedly rallied by a mysterious coded radio message. Alert, alert, look well at the rainbow. The fish will be running very soon. From the sea and by parachute, the rebels have struck along the coast within 90 miles of Havana. Initial accounts of the fighting sketchy, but strafing and bombing of communications and military targets reported with heavy casualties. Fidel's grip is threatened as word of some defections comes out. But the fiery bearded Castro is hardly short on words as he attacks what he calls United States imperialism and calls on sister Latin American republics to aid Cuba. Impounded in Miami, one of the 3 B-26s which bombed Cuban bases before the invasion. They're of a type purchased by Cuba from the U.S. during Batista's regime. The Cuban bomber pilot, concealing his identity, says he had planned his defection flight for 3 months. Meanwhile, in Havana, acting Foreign Minister Olivares shows foreign envoys and newsmen scorched fragments of what may have been rockets fired during the B-26 raids. As might be expected, he points an accusing finger at the U.S. The same line is followed at a dramatic meeting of the United Nations General Assembly's Political Committee by Cuban Foreign Minister Raul Roa, charging his nation has been invaded by what he terms mercenaries from Guatemala and Florida. Quickly, forcefully, the charges are denied by Chief U.S. Delegate Adlai E. Stevenson.
These charges are totally false, and I deny them categorically. The United States has committed no aggression against Cuba, and no offensive has been launched from Florida or from any other part of the United States.
And yet, by April 20th, 1961, Robert F. Kennedy would admit to the fact that, in fact, we may have been involved. And he says, first and foremost, the neutrality laws are the oldest in the books, right? And he calls attention to minor revisions. They were not designed for the kinds of situation that exists today. And then he says, effectively, that if individuals want to do this, that the United States is not going to stop them, right? That the reality is that these individuals who wanted to go to a third country and in order to deal with this, that it's in fact not something that necessarily the United States should be emboldened to stop. All of this is operating within the same landscape as news begins to spread, and particularly persuasive imagery of thick winged duck. Because what happens back in Vietnam is that US backed Prime Minister Diem officially bans Buddha's holiday from being celebrated in the public spaces. Are Americans involved? And if so, to what degree? Are we on the right side here? Who are we representing? Do we represent Diem or the Vietnamese people? And this becomes a core component, complication, and a major embarrassment for American political and diplomatic interests. And then, of course, by September, John F. Kennedy is assassinated.
In downtown Dallas, President Kennedy was shot today just as his motorcade left downtown Dallas. Mrs. Kennedy jumped up and grabbed Mr. Kennedy. She cried, "Oh no." The motorcade sped on. A photographer said he saw blood on the president's head. It was believed 2 shots were fired. Keep tuned to your NBC station for the later news.
NBC Newsroom in New York. President Kennedy and Governor John Connally of Texas have been cut down by assassins' bullets in downtown Dallas. We'll repeat that. President Kennedy and Governor John Connally of Texas have been cut down by assassins' bullets in downtown Dallas. They were riding in an open automobile when the shots were fired. The president, his limp body cradled in the arms of his wife, Jacqueline, had been rushed to Parkland Hospital. Clint Hill, a Secret Service agent assigned to Mrs. Kennedy, said he's dead as the president was lifted from the rear of a White House touring car, the famous bubble top from Washington. He was rushed to an emergency room in the hospital. Other White House officials were in doubt as the corridors of the hospital erupted in pandemonium. The incident occurred just east of the Triple Underpass facing a park in downtown Dallas. Reporters about 5 car lengths behind the chief executive were behind the autocade. Stay tuned to your NBC station for the later news.
Was he dead? We don't know. Thing is, Americans are dealing with this kind of tragedy where there's unclear as to what should and what has happened, right? And so here we see on television 38 minutes after Kennedy is declared dead, Cronkite
From
struggles with
Dallas,
the
Texas,
announcement.
the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, some 38 minutes ago. Vice President Lyndon Johnson has left the hospital in Dallas, but we do not know to where he has proceeded. Presumably, he will be taking the oath of office shortly and become the 36th President of the United States.
And this is where the United States stands. By August of 1964, we find an American destroyer fired upon in the Gulf of Tonkin. And the United States responds by declaring war. But it's not a normal war. Again, it's not an actual war. It's just to promote the maintenance and international peace and security in Southeast Asia. And that ultimately the commander in chief will be able to use any means necessary in order to repel any armed attacker against the forces of the United States, and that this resolution shall expire when the president determines that peace and security in the area is reasonably assured by international conditions. This is vague, right? And yet we find ourselves contending with this larger landscape of the war itself.